Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Matthew Boyle, and I'm going to be teaching you how to make a perfect game card for your next card game. I'm going to talk to you a lot about the font, the layout, the colors, and explain to you everything I consider when I'm designing a card. Now, if you're not familiar with me or what I do, I actually founded a language learning card game company in 2016. The company name is Language Card Games. You can check out my work on this channel or at languagecardgames.com. Now, I've focused in on the niche of language learning, but I think, whether you're into language learning or not, that's doesn't really matter because in today's video, we're going to be talking about a lot of elements that go into making a perfect game card, sort of like the design elements. So if you're interested in making or designing your own card game, or if you want to learn about all the thought that goes into the card games that I design, I think you're really going to like this video today. So let me move. I don't know if this little bar is going to be in the video. I hope not. Let me move that out of the way. Okay, I've got my little spotlight tool here. And in this year, 2023, I released my latest card game. It's called Heading Into Language Land. And this is one character card from that game. Now, the very first thing you're probably going to notice is that all the text is over top of the art, and there's no sort of background boxes behind the game text. So what you'll see that's very common in a lot of card games like Pokemon or Magic the Gathering or Yu-Gi-Oh! Is they usually have a square box on the bottom half of the card, maybe a little square box in the middle of the card, little square box at the top. And that really serves two functions. It serves as a solid color background so that people can see the text easily. It also just looks nice because each text area has a boxed in border section. It probably also helps the designers who just need to plug in text onto card templates. It probably helps to center and organize everything. This was a card game where I didn't do that. I wanted to have a design that looked different and stood out a little bit. And I decided that I would make the text bigger and not use solid color background boxes behind the text. So that was one of the reasons why I made the text a little bit bigger, was because I knew it would have to stand out against a background that would sometimes be a little bit busy. Now, at first I was thinking I would center everything, but for some reason that just looked odd, and it felt like it was covering up too much of the artwork. So then I had the idea of, well, I could move most everything off to the left side and keep it from going too far to the right. So in a way, I would put things more to the left side and free up space for the artwork. So all of the artwork that I get done for this game, I ask the artist to keep the focal points in the center right area of the game card. So this is basically how I came up with a unique design for my game, and I recommend you do the same. You don't have to design or lay out your card in the same ways that you've always seen done. One of the things that I advocate is, one of the things that I often say is, your cards right away are going to be kind of like the advertisement for your game. So you want them to stand out. You want them to be different. So think outside of the box. Think outside of the frame of the game card. So the first thing just there that we talked about is sort of the layout of the game card and why game companies will they often center their text and put boxes behind them. Well, that's why, so they can be seen easily. So the next consideration we'll talk about has to do with the font. Now, here's where things get really interesting because there's so many font choices available now. And there's a lot of fonts that are free. There's a lot that are paid for. You can even have people design unique fonts for you. So there's a tremendous amount of options when it comes to the fonts, and it's easy to get carried away there. Obviously, you want something that looks interesting, but you don't want it to be too crazy that it affects the readability and it affects the accessibility of your game. So you have to strike a balance there. One idea that I came up with when I was making this game was I thought to myself, I could make the titles or the names of the game cards a little bit more fancy because the name of the cards actually doesn't really affect their function. Obviously, you would want the rule text to be super clear and readable, but the name is actually a little bit less important to the actual gameplay, so I felt a little more free to be more fancy there. But as you can see, I didn't even choose something super fancy for the names of the cards, but I would recommend you choose no more than two different types of fonts. And you want to choose two fonts that pair well uh, when they go together, when you see them on the same card. So I chose for the names of the card Sinsel because it has a little bit of a fanciful look because this is a fantasy themed card game. So maybe like if you're doing a sci-fi game, you would choose something a little more sci-fi-ish or a little more steampunk or a little more horror or whatever style of game you're doing. And then for all the other font on the game card, I chose a different font, which is Economica. And I decided to choose Economica because it conserves space by compressing the text from left to right. So I knew I was going to be increasing the size of the font to be a little bigger than most game cards um, use. And we'll get to that. We'll get to why I did that in a minute. But I thought, if I'm going to make the game text bigger, I better choose a font that compresses the letters and the words from left to right to sort of make up for the space that I'm losing. You know, some fonts are quite wide from left to right. Some are pretty standard and some are compressed. This is one that's pretty compressed from left to right. And also, it keeps the letters looking pretty clear. That's another thing that you want to keep in mind. If you look at some of the letters here, like the the C's and the G's and the Y's and the T's and the L's and the F's, you want to make sure they're pretty easy to distinguish. And I've actually done some pretty interesting research into font creation, and I found out that some fonts were designed to be easy for people with reading disabilities to read. Some of the most popular fonts that we all know are widely used for a reason because most people in the world can read those letters more easily. So that's a reason why those fonts exist. You can do more research on that on your own if you're interested. Um, but to get back to the size of the fonts too, that's an interesting thing that you ought to consider. You want the font to be obviously not too small because if it's too small, when people have the cards down on the table, they're going to have trouble to see at a glance the information that they need. And they're going to have to pick up the cards and squint their eyes and look close to find out the information. That's not good. That's inhibiting the gameplay. And I've seen some professionally made games which are quite successful and quite popular, but they contain a lot of really small symbols and text, which really surprises me sometimes. I think that's a bad idea. So even professional game designers and game design companies make that mistake. Don't let that happen to you. Make sure things are fairly easy for people to see at a glance. Now, in my game, I made certain text features, especially the word categories in the middle of the card, even bigger. Now, why is that? I could have made it smaller and left even more room for amazing artwork. But here I have some pretty big word categories taking up a lot of space. The reason for that is twofold. One, this is a language learning game. It's very important that words be large and clear. I have a lot of people playing this game all over the world who English is a second language to them. And this game might get translated into other languages in the future too. But anyway, it's a language learning game, so the words need to be large and clear. Second, when we play this game, at least on the real physical table, the way this game functions is cards are placed out onto the table to make the quote unquote spaces of the board. So when people flip over cards and see the word categories, I don't want them to have to lift up the card and look carefully at the card to see what's that word category. I wanted them to be able to leave the cards in place on the table and see them comfortably from a distance. So that was my consideration on the size of the words on my game cards. Some of the words on the game card are a bit smaller, and that's because um, if players really want to know that information, that means they're more experienced or hardcore gamers. So at that point, I know they're going to be fine with looking at the game card more closely to check that rule or check that information. But that happening is probably going to be more rare. So I felt comfortable to make that information smaller, like the type of the card under the name or the card sort of stats or ratings on the bottom left. That part is really more for people who really, really, really want to know, who really want to get into the strategy of the game. They would probably be learning and memorizing much more about the cards, so they would be studying it more closely on their own time, probably. But those parts, that information doesn't affect the basic way that we play the game, so it can be smaller. Another thing that you'll notice is I made a border. I made a border color around all the text. That's also to help it pop and to help it be more readable against an artwork background, because again, I'm not using boxes of solid color behind the game text. So I thought of the idea to use a border to help the text be more readable, because sometimes, for instance, I might have, say, for example, white clouds in the sky. So the white game text up at the top of the card, that will be lost. But a border helps everything to stand out because it provides contrast. Okay, so we've talked about sort of the position of the words. We've talked about the size of the words, the font, the color. Wow, we've talked about a lot of things to be considered here. If I've missed anything that you'd like to learn about, just leave me a comment down below and we can get into the discussion more there. I'd be happy to chat with you about your card game designs. Maybe you can post a link to what you're working on and I can offer some advice or opinions, constructive criticisms, and so on. One other thing that well, there's a couple things we haven't mentioned that I can see. One is the italicized game text, okay? So I like to include some flavor text or some story text on my game cards, which comes from stories that I wrote to support the game. And I learned from my experience making my first few games that it's very important that that text look different so people understand that's not a part of the rules. So I did two things. I italicized that text and I also put it in quotes. So another thing you could do is possibly put a little thin line between rule text and story text to help differentiate those two things. And then another consideration is the border. So sometimes in the past, I didn't put a border on my game cards because I thought it looked cool to have even more space for the artwork. I still think that can look cool in some instances, but it's hard to ignore the fact that a nice border on the game card creates a nice finished look. People kind of come to expect that. It also can help the card to keep a nice look even when the edges are getting worn down a little bit. So it has that nice effect of creating a finished look. So it's easy to put white borders or black border, really any color border you want, any style of border that you want. If you're using a design program, you can put any kind of border around your card. You don't have to use the typical borders. I've used a typical black border here because I want the virtual game deck that I've made and the print and play PDF game that I've made to look identical to the real cards. And on the real cards, I've put a typical black border because I think that looks the most sleek. I think that looks the most cool. All right. I think that about wraps it up for this game. There's still more on here that we could talk about. There's still more that I didn't get to, but if you guys like this video, if you think it's interesting, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment. Maybe you guys can give me some ideas and some questions for what I should talk about in a part 2 video. We could do a part 2 and we could talk even more about some of your questions related to card game design. And also, if you want to see all the games that I've designed, because I've done about maybe 6 different game lines with different styles of designs since 2016. If you want to see that, you can visit my website at languagecardgames.com. But that's it for this one. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope to see you back here again real soon. Bye bye for now.